In this video, I'm going to be showing you the step-by-step guide in order to complete all of the quest lines in Shadow of the Erdtree. We of course did a very similar video for the base game, and much like how we presented it in that video, I will just be showing you the quickest or the most efficient way to complete all of the quest lines to of course make it as no nonsense as possible. Also, there will be timestamps that you can use to go to whichever relevant quest that you're looking for, and again, when I start talking about a new quest line in this video, I will let you know if it intertwines or interferes with any other NPC's quest in the DLC. But all in all, this is going to be one comprehensive video with all of the steps necessary for every single quest, so feel free to save this, bookmark it, share it with others, and I hope you don't mind me asking you to leave a like rating on this video if it helps you out in any way. But other than that, we've got some crazy quest lines to complete, so let's get things started. Now, just quickly, before I actually start getting into the first quest line I want to go through with you, I need to make you aware that there is a point of no return, or at least a trigger point, that will lock you out of certain quest lines if you haven't completed it before that event. And again, a big spoiler alert, that particular event is when you burn the sealing tree to gain access to Inner Ilum. So essentially, I implore you to do all of these quest lines, which pretty much can be done before you burn the sealing tree, but there are one or two quest lines that need a little bit of extra progress after burning it, but again, I will let you know what quests they are, and then that way you'll be able to complete all of the quests in one save and be able to obtain all of the unique weapons, armors, and items that they all grant you to then have an immense amount of fun to replay Elden Ring again. But of course, we've got a bunch of NPC questlines to go through, and the first one that I want to go through with you guys is going to be Igon's questline, because how can we not when he has such a legendary monologue? Curse you, Bale! So, if you want to experience that monologue for yourself, let me show you the steps for his quest. Now, in order to meet Igon for the first time, we do need to head over to the Pillar Path waypoint, Site of Grace, which can be accessed as soon as you load up in the DLC. But essentially, when you come to this specific spot in your game, you should hear Igon cursing Bale for the amount of pain that he's currently in, and after speaking to him at this location and exhausting all of his dialogue, we can then head further south down this path that he's sitting in front of, and we will be invaded by the Dragon Man. Defeat said Dragon Man and keep walking in that direction, and you will come to Dragon's Pit, where again you can traverse through this cave and you will come to this area which looks like an endless abyss. We do need to be a bit brave and jump into said abyss and defeat the true Dragon Man who is residing at the bottom of this pit. Once defeating the Dragon Man, you will then be able to head out to the Jagged Peak area, and if you keep heading down towards the lake, you will be greeted by a Jagged Peak dragon, but more importantly, there is a path to your left and a path to your right. If you go left, you will then start climbing the Jagged Peak and meet Igon a couple more times, but if you hang right, you will be able to walk up to the Dragon Communion altar with the Dragon Priestess residing beside it. The Dragon Priestess is another NPC tied in with Igon's quest as well, as they both reside around the actions you take against Bale, who is the final boss in this area. But essentially, with the Priestess more specifically, there are two ways that you can end her part of the quest and get two separate rewards. That is because after you embed yourself with the Draconic Essence, you can either just simply scale the Jagged Peak and go and defeat Bale, to which when you come back to the Priestess afterwards, you will be able to obtain her heart and her weapon. But before doing all of that, if you actually go and meet Moore and Thiollier, who are other NPCs in this DLC, you will be able to create Thiolier's concoction, which is an endless sleep potion, and when you change the time of the game to nightfall and come back to the Priestess, you will notice that she is praying to Placidusax, and at this point, so only at nighttime, you will be able to give her Thiolier's concoction, and then if you beat Bale after giving her the concoction, you will actually get her as a summon to bring into your boss fight. So like I say, you still need to beat Bale to get either one of those rewards, but the reward you get obviously depends on whether or not you give her Thiolier's concoction. Either way, if you give her the concoction or not, we do need to make our way up the Jagged Peak, and again, Igon can be found in this specific area where there are going to be two Jagged Peak dragons fighting one another. You do in fact need to defeat these dragons in order to speak to Igon afterwards, to which he will congratulate you and treat you as a fellow Drake warrior. To progress his quest even further, you do need to exhaust all of his dialogue here, because once you do so, you will get Igon's specific furled finger that will allow you to summon him in the fight against Bale. And then essentially from this point we just simply need to keep going up the jagged peak, and as a little side note, you can actually run past Sassenach, so you don't need to fight this dragon at all. If you just hang left and use Torrent, you can just run up the slope, and then once you've done that there will be one final spirit spring that will take you outside of Bale's arena. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, as long as you've got that furled finger from Igon himself, his summon sign will appear in this location in the boss fight. It's sort of like just to the left as soon as you enter, but if you do enter the boss fight for the first time, you will have to walk past it to get Bale to spawn in. So as soon as he spawns in, sort of do a bit of a U-turn and summon Igon in. But other than just hearing his legendary monologue that's obviously been memed across the entire internet for the past month, you will now have to take on Bale and defeat Bale whilst Igon is still alive. Obviously the DLC bosses can be quite hard, so I highly recommend that not only do you increase your Shadow Tree rating as much as physically possible, but I highly recommend that you bring a fairly broken or fairly powerful build, or failing that, just bring Ancient Lightning Dragon Strike and you'll be good to go. And then essentially, after you defeat Bale, Igon will give his final bit of monologue, and after he disappears, you can then head back to where his body was after the double dragon fight towards the foot of the jagged peak, and there will be all of his items along with his bell bearing to pick up. And then once you've got those items, you can also head back to the Dragon Priestess at the altar of the Dragon Communion, and depending on whether or not you gave her the concoction, you will now get your relevant reward. So like I say, if you gave her the concoction, you will now get her as a spirit summon, but if you didn't give her the concoction, you will now get her weapon and her heart, which will actually allow you to become a dragon yourself. So yes, you can only choose one or the other per playthrough, and then on top of that, after defeating Bale, you can also use his heart to get one of his legendary communion spells. And then essentially with all of those rewards collected, that will complete Igon and sort of like the Dragon Communion questline in the DLC. Now next up, we've actually got one of the shortest questlines in the entire DLC, and that is because up next we're going to talk about Dryleaf Dane. Dryleaf Dane is one of the new NPCs that also gives us one of the new weapon types, which are the hand-to-hand striking combats through the Dryleaf arts as well as his footwork. But in order to start his very short quest, you do have to meet him at the Morph Ruins Site of Grace. Now there are multiple ways that you can get here. If you want to go through Castle Ensis and defeat Rolana, you can obviously go through that way to get to Morph Ruins. But if you want to get there without beating any bosses, there is actually a spirit spring that is just behind Fort Reprimand, and I'm just going to show you the path on screen now, because if you come from the pillar path across Site of Grace, you can essentially go down this little cliff face using the various ledges to get down into the canyon below. And essentially if you keep heading straight on as soon as you get to the bottom and follow the path round the cliff, you will then come to this spirit spring that will in fact be locked, and you do need to hit this sort of like phantom pebble stone to unlock that spirit spring. Luckily it's not too far away, it's literally just on like the little ledge above, and once you break the seal, the spirit spring will become available and you can jump all the way up to the Fort of Reprimand, and essentially from there you can head north to the Morph Ruins. But either way, when you get here, Dryleaf Dane will be at this Site of Grace, and he doesn't really say that much to you if you try talking to him, but once you've interacted with him, we can then head to the High Road Cross Site of Grace, which is just next to the Morph Ruins. And when you get to this Site of Grace, there will be Leda and Hornsent waiting at this grace, but we don't need to interact with any of them. We just simply need to pick up these items on the floor, as we'll get both the monk's letter and the gesture, may the best win. That letter is telling us to use said gesture in front of Dryleaf Dane, and that's essentially the next and really only step in this entire quest, because once you do that and activate the jewel, when you defeat him, you will get not only the Dryleaf Arts weapon, but you will also get Dryleaf Dane's hat. And as I say, that is pretty much it for the quest, because just a little bit of a spoiler alert, he will then not turn up again until you fight Leda in the final area of the game. But the good thing is you will still get another prize after beating him here alongside Leda, as you will get his footworks but you don't get his armor set. The armor set is located here on the map, and you do need to go down the sort of like secret area in the Shadow Keep to gain access to the ruins of Unte, and then if you head directly south from those ruins, you will then get to this particular area where you can pick up the rest of the Dryleaf armor. But as I say, Dryleaf Dane's quest is actually fully complete when you beat him in both More Ruins and also in Inner Ilum. So now that easy quest is out of the way, let's move on to the next one. And for our next quest, we are actually going to go through Thiollier's quest, or Thiollier, however you pronounce his name. This dude that is hanging out just next to the Pillar Path Cross Site of Grace, and again, you can get here as soon as you load up the DLC, because all you need to do is cross the Elac Great Bridge and then take the path east to come to this Site of Grace. In fact, it's just before you meet Igon. But after meeting him here, it becomes very apparent that he's a little bit lost and is a little bit harsh on himself, but he is incredibly useful. That is because one of the first things he can help us with is creating his deadly concoction, which is an endless sleep potion, which is what we can actually use on NPCs like the Dragon Priestess to complete parts of their certain quests. And in order to do that, not only do you need to meet Thiollier, but you also need to meet the NPC Moore, who is going to be residing at the main gate cross Site of Grace. Again, you can get here as soon as you jump into the DLC, and after interacting with both of these NPCs, if you talk to Moore, he will actually tell you he has got a specific item for Thiollier. That specific item is the black syrup, and if you take that to Thiollier, he will then turn that into his deadly concoction. But as I say, that item more impacts other NPCs' questlines in the game and doesn't directly affect Thiollier, and the actual next step for Thiollier's questline is to go and activate the event where Miquella breaks his rune. This is done by going into close proximity of the Shadow Keep, and is actually the trigger point for pretty much every other NPC quest to move them on to the next necessary steps, as when Miquella breaks his rune, it essentially releases the bind that these characters have towards Miquella, and they start progressing down their own paths, and more specifically for Thiollier, he is on a path to find St.Trina. So after breaking Miquella's rune, speak to Thiollier again and exhaust all of his dialogue where he will tell you this, and then our new task is to go and find St.Trina and tell Thiollier of their whereabouts. And St.Trina is located in the Stone Coffin Fissure area, which is accessed through the south of the Cerulean coast. Essentially head to the southmost region of that coast, and again there will be a massive crater in the middle, and you can use the various ledges to get yourself down to the Site of Grace. Essentially, all you've got to do is work your way through this area, and when you come to the Fissure Depths Site of Grace, you'll be able to jump off of this like little area, and once again take the plunge to the areas below. And again, just a word of warning, after you make this jump, you will be met with one of the main remembrance bosses, this time being the Putrescent Knight. Again, you will have to defeat this boss, because upon doing so, you will then have access to this sort of like little cave where St.Trina is located. So once you've beaten the boss and located St.Trina, talk to St.Trina, but do not imbibe the nectar just yet, because as soon as you've interacted with St.Trina, you can then head back to Thiollier and notify him of St.Trina's location. And lo and behold, once you've done that, you can then head back to St.Trina, to which you can find Thiollier residing nearby. Essentially, from this point on, Thiollier is trying to be imbued with the endless sleep so he can speak to St.Trina, as he believes he is the chosen one to speak to St.Trina, but in fact, you are of course the chosen one, and you do now need to imbibe the nectar 4 times. This does mean that you have to go through a death animation 4 times in a row, so it can be a bit tedious, but after the 2 or 3 minutes of going back and forth and imbuing the nectar 4 times, you will get some dialogue from St.Trina, and when you get these pieces of dialogue, you can then speak to Thiollier again and try and pass on the message. After trying to say this for the first time round, he will not believe you, as like I say, he believes he is the chosen one to speak to St.Trina, but after trying to deliver the message a second time, he will actually now become hostile, and whether you imbue the nectar one more time or go and rest at the Site of Grace, Thiollier will actually invade your world by the Site of Grace just outside of this little cave, to which of course you need to take him down. And after you defeat Thiollier, not only will you get St.Trina's Smile, which is a brand new talisman, but you can then go and speak to St.Trina one last time and imbibe the nectar once more, and after you get your final message from St.Trina, Thiollier should again reappear in this cave, and you can exhaust his dialogue, therefore completing this quest in its entirety. And just to sort of give you like a generic tip with this quest, if for whatever reason you still cannot progress or certain dialogues aren't happening, it's probably because you need to reset your game, so whether that's resting at a site of grace or imbibing the nectar one more time. I believe St.Trina only has 3 different dialogue options, and the final dialogue is basically telling you that you need to defeat Miquella. So if you get that from St.Trina and for whatever reason Thiollier isn't going any further with his dialogue, just rest at the site of grace, ensure that you've exhausted all of his dialogue up to that point, and you should get this sort of like final dialogue, which is just him sort of like groaning in pain, I guess, or about to fall asleep. And essentially when you get this piece of specific dialogue from him, that is the quest complete. And once his quest is fully complete, Thiollier will actually appear later on in the DLC, both being a helpful summon for the Leda fight, but more specifically being a helpful summon for the final boss. I'm not going to show footage of the final boss because I don't want to ruin that for you guys, but essentially upon defeating the final boss either with or without Thiollier's help, his body will be there in the arena, to which you can pick up all of his unique items, including his armor and a very unique weapon in his needle. And essentially after you've done all of these steps and beaten the entire DLC to get these items, that renders Thiollier's quest fully complete. And in actual fact, the next NPC I want to talk about is someone who actually has a direct connection with Thiollier, and of course that NPC is Mor himself. Mor's quest is relatively simple and you can pretty much do it straight off the bat, and to meet him in the first place you do need to gain access to the main Gatecross site of grace, and essentially after speaking to him here, he will become a merchant where you can buy certain materials from him. Basically, Mor's shtick in the DLC is being the collector and the vendor for the rest of the NPCs in the DLC. But as I've already mentioned multiple times throughout this video, Mor actually helps us create the Thiolier's concoction. Basically, after speaking to Mor, you can then go speak to Thiollier, and after interacting with both of them respectively, you can then head back to Mor and he will give you the black syrup to go and give to Thiollier. I know, a lot of back and forth there. But other than that, there are actually going to be 6 pests residing around the DLC, and Mor is actually essentially their leader as he leads the Forager Brood, which essentially is a group including all of these pests that go out and hunt for materials and items throughout the Shadow Realm. So essentially we need to find these pests and interact with them, and they will all give us a Forager cookbook, and once we've collected all of those, we can then head back to Mor and he will give us the final cookbook as well. So for the location of the first pest is actually very close by to where Mor is located, because going from the main Gatecross site of grace, if you go to head back to the main area but hang right around the cliff face, you will then be able to come to the Cliff Road Terminus site of grace, which is just outside of the Prospect town. And if you come to this exact location on the map, there will be the first pest you can interact with and get the cookbook as well as another item. And then for the location of the second pest, if you make your way to Morph Ruins, just to the west of that site of grace, just slightly above the ruined forge that's here in this exact location, you will be able to find yet another pest chilling in like this little corner by the ledge. Again, interact with that and you'll get yet another cookbook. And then for the third pest, there's actually one near the Cerulean Coast site of grace, very close to the location where you get the lightning perfume bottle. And again, there's multiple ways that you can get to this location. The easiest one, or at least the quickest one from when you start off the DLC, will in fact be coming to the Pillar Path cross site of grace and using that pathway down to the ravine as if we're going that backwards route to the Fort of Reprimand. But instead of going left and carrying up that way, if you turn right and go through this cave system, when you come out on the other side, you will then be able to turn left and go through a much larger cave system, and after doing a bunch of jumping puzzles traversing through this massive cave, you will then come out to the other end where you can see a fire furnace off in the distance. But again, if you hang left and keep hanging left by going through this sort of like wooded area, you will then come across this pest. Again, I'll be showing you the location exactly on the map right now. But if you've also got the Cerulean Coast site of grace, you can just sort of head north, head straight past the lightning bottle, and again, you'll be able to get this pest. And then once you've interacted with that pest and got the cookbook from him, we can then head back to Morph Ruins, but this time head north, specifically through this little lake, and in the gap in the cliff there past like the Mikola statue, you will again come to this swamp area where you can go straight ahead, because right in front of you, pretty much directly north in this location on the map, will be yet another pest where you can again interact with them and get yet another cookbook. And then the second to last pest is actually a little bit of a ways away, because it actually requires us to go almost all the way to the back entrance of Shadow Keep. And again, I'll show you the exact location on the map right now, so we need to be heading in that general direction. And again, the way that you get there is by going through the ruins in Morph Ruins. I should hopefully be showing you this on the screen, but essentially, as long as you work your way through the ruins, going through all the different rubble and jumping carefully down through all the various different tunnels, there will eventually be a ladder that you can climb that will take you up to Boney Village. And then essentially, as long as you follow the path through Boney Village all the way up to the Church District High Road Site of Grace, from there, like I say, if you start heading towards Shadow Keep, but again, hang a little bit left, you can jump up this sort of like plateau, and then by heading to the very corner, you will again be able to find a pest residing there to which you can interact, and guess what? Get another cookbook. But there is one final pest that we need to find, and the reason why I'm leaving this one till last is because we actually need to heal him. And this last pest is just behind the Church of the Crusade, which is just northwest of the High Road Cross Site of Grace. And as I say, if you come to this location that I'm showing on the map, there will be a pest that is injured and we need to heal them. We can do this by using a warming stone. You can craft these items, but you should hopefully have one or two in your inventory already, and by using the warming stone to heal them, he will then wake up, and again you can interact with him to get the last cookbook that you need from the pests. And if for whatever reason you can't interact with them after healing, just reload your game, so go back to the Site of Grace or save and quit out and reload, and then you'll be able to interact with the pest. And after you've got all 6 of those cookbooks, if you return to Moor, he'll not only thank you for helping out all of the Forager brood, but he will give you a 7th cookbook which allows you to make spirit raisins as well as a charming branch, and then you would have also got a load of pickled livers that boost various defenses and abilities for your character. Essentially, we needed to do this before the next step, because the next step in this quest is to actually go to the Shadow Keep and shatter the rune. Now this might happen when you go to the pest that is located sort of right next to the Shadow Keep, because essentially the shattering of the rune happens whenever you get close enough to the Shadow Keep. As long as you don't interact with Moor again before completing all of the rest of the pests, if that does happen, you should be fine to get the rest of the cookbooks. But essentially, once that rune has shattered, Moor will then be able to speak to you again, and where the rune has been broken, he will tell you that he feels that Mikola's light is gone, so he's got no direction and believes that their mother has now left their brood. Now here, you will have 3 options for 3 different endings to Moor's quest. You will be able to tell him to either put it behind him and then carry on with things like, don't worry about it, you're all good, or you can tell him to remain sad forever, or just simply say, I don't know. Essentially, if you tell him not to worry about it and put it behind you, he will then move on to the final area of the game and actually become a summon during the Leda fight, but he will be fighting against you. And again, if you do that option and defeat him in that fight, you will get his armor and all of the rest of the items that he drops as well. But if you want to get those items straight away, you can tell him to remain sad forever, and if you tell him to do that, if you remember that pest that we had to heal behind the church, he will actually go and lay by that particular pest and actually pass away together alongside that pest, and again will have all of his items dropped. But if you say I don't know, he will actually remain as a merchant and remain at the main gate cross Site of Grace for the rest of the DLC, but you won't be able to get his armor if you do choose that I don't know option. So of course, feel free to use one of those options, do as you please, but I highly recommend that, as much as it's really sad, that you tell him to stay sad forever, as that will be the easiest way to get all of his items, including his bell bearing. But obviously just make sure that you do all of the pests before talking to Moor after breaking Mikola's rune, and then that way you will be able to complete all of the necessary steps to get all of the necessary items from Moor's questline. But of course, moving on to the next questline in this video, we are now going to go through the steps that are necessary to complete Ymir's, or more specifically the Cathedral of Metyr questline. Now again, this is actually a relatively straightforward quest and has very minimal steps in order to get all the necessary items from said quest, because to start things off, all you simply need to do is gain access to the cathedral and meet Ymir himself, and in order to do that you do need to go through the Moor ruins to then gain access to Boney Village, and I will be showing you quickly how to do that on screen, because again, by going through the ruins you'll be able to go through the various tunnels in said ruins, and then you will come to this ladder, and guess what, taking the ladder up will take you to Boney Village. And then as you can see on the map, as long as you go through this path and then head up to the Church District High Road site of Grace, you can then hang left and get yourself to the Cathedral of Manus Metyr. When you get here, you do need to speak to Ymir, and after doing so, he will give you the whole Leda necklace, which is used to ring certain bells around the map. Now there's 2 in total, and both of these bells are residing in the middle of the 2 different finger ruins throughout the Shadow Realm. Now I will of course show you how to get to these finger ruins, and I'll firstly tell you how to get to the finger ruins of Rhea, which is in the south of the Shadow Realm, and the best way to get here is to actually make your way down to the Cerulean coast, and more specifically come to the Cerulean coast cross site of Grace as if you're making your way towards the fissure, and from this site of Grace you can basically just head down this little section leading towards the shoreline, and then by going across the shallow water you can then work your way up to the ruins of Rhea. Essentially, from here, you just need to walk down into the ruins of Rhea and head your way to the middle where the first bell is located. Just watch out for these guys, and more specifically the pink orbs that are flying about, because they will knock you off torrent and also trap you for about 10 seconds. But essentially, after ringing the bell here, I believe you get the Crimson Medallion from this particular one, and then once you've got that, we can then start making our way to the second ruins, which is the ruins of Deo, that is residing in the north of the Shadow Realm. Now in order to get to this second ruins, the route is a little bit convoluted, but before you even start going to this specific ruins, we do need to pick up a certain gesture, and I'll explain why in a moment, but I advise that you head your way back to Boney Village, and more specifically this area just past the trees in Boney Village, and you will be able to pick up the Oh Mother gesture, which is residing right here. Once you've got that gesture, we then need to make our way to the back entrance of Shadow Keep, and again you can get to this location by going directly north from the Cathedral of Manus Metyr, and again I'm going to show you visually on screen where you need to go from the Church District entrance site of Grace, because it can be a little bit hard to explain, but essentially after doing the jumping puzzles on the various rooftops to get around the flooded version of this area, when you actually go through the hole in the roof and then the hole in the floor to get to the lower section of this church, instead of taking the first left exit where you would normally go to drain the water that's in this area, if you carry on going past these enemies and head down the corridor and take the second left, you will then be able to take a lift that will then take you to the storehouse back section site of Grace. This will put you back in sort of like the main area of the Shadow Keep, and by taking the ladder that's right next to the site of Grace and carrying up through there, you will then come to the storehouse loft site of Grace where these 2 elevators are located, and when you take the elevator up to the beams that are high above, again there will be a ladder sort of like further along one of these beams, which you can then use to get to a little bit of a higher up ground to then jump onto like this little cog, which you can then jump onto the section down below. This will then lead you outside, and by following this path outside, you will be able to then use the one final lift that will take you down to the Shadow Keep back gate site of Grace. This is where Commander Guise is located, that really annoying boss that's on the horseback, but luckily we don't have to take that boss on for this, because if you actually turn right from this site of Grace and go into this room where the Miquella statue is located, you can use that Oh Mother gesture in front of this statue and a secret door will open. This will open up what is called Shadow View, and by going through this area, basically just heading straight forward from where you've opened up, you will then eventually come to the ruins of Deo, and of course in the middle will be yet another bell you can ring using that necklace. And then once you've rang this bell of Deo and the bell in the ruins of Rhea, you can then go straight back to Ymir in the Cathedral of Manus Metyr and exhaust all of his dialogue options to then progress with the rest of the quest. It is imperative that you actually exhaust all of his dialogue options and making sure he's got nothing left to say and only has like his purchase options available in his menu. And also, just as a side note, yes, Ymir is a vendor, and yes, each bell that you ring will grant some extra spells in his store, so I highly recommend recommend that if you're looking for alternative spells to use in the game, that you also purchase them from him now before moving on to the next step, because after you've exhausted all of his dialogue, if you rest at the site of grace that's inside the cathedral, he would have disappeared, and you can now examine his chair. By examining his chair, you'll press the button on it and it will open up a brand new area that you can go down, which is actually a third and final finger ruins. As soon as you come down this ladder and start heading to the bell you can see in the distance, you will in fact be invaded by one of his knights. This particular invader will be Anna, and she actually drops one of the coolest weapons in the game, being the Claws of Night. But after you successfully defeated Anna, you can then go and ring the third and final bell, and then you will be teleported into a boss fight. This is a remembrance boss, and more specifically is the Mother of the Fingers remembrance boss, and it can be a little bit tricky, but it is ultimately fairly easy as long as you stay in front of this boss and hit them in their weak spot, like right in their chest. I highly recommend that you just bring a bleed weapon, as this enemy is very susceptible to bleed. But essentially, after defeating this boss, you do have to teleport once again back to the cathedral and once again examine the chair. Here is where again you will be invaded by the second knight, being Yolan, who is actually residing next to Ymir by one of the pillars, but she actually doesn't interact with you pretty much in any single way, which is why I haven't mentioned her until now. But after you beat Yolan, Ymir will appear once more and will be another boss you need to take down. Again, he's very weak to bleed damage, but he can use finger sorceries and also summon in those finger spiders, so obviously just be very careful with this fight. I highly recommend putting on a load of pressure at the very beginning of the fight. But essentially, once you defeat Ymir, that will render the quest complete, and you will get all of his armor as well as his bell bearing and also the maternal staff. And once you've done this quest in full, you can actually speak to Jalan afterwards, and after speaking to her, you can either give her an Iris of Grace or an Iris of Oculation, and if you give her the Grace, she will become a summon that you can use, but if you give her the Oculation, she will actually give you the Sword of Night. So again, you've got multiple options for Jalan, or at least the items that you get when speaking to Jalan. But again, if you actually head out to the courtyard where all of the graves are located, you will actually be able to pick up the Cherishing Fingers spell that is residing just in front of Yura's grave. Yep, that's right. I'm not a lore guy, so I don't know what Yura's doing in this particular graveyard. So if anyone knows, feel free to educate us in the comments down below. But essentially, after speaking to Jalan, picking up this spell and defeating Ymir, that renders this quest line complete. But with Ymir out the way, there's still a couple more quests that we've got left, and I'm actually going to be merging two characters together with this particular quest line, because I'm going to show you the steps necessary to complete both Ansbach's quest and also Freyja. Now, in order to meet these two characters for the first time, you do have to meet Freyja at the 3-path cross site of Grace, and Ansbach a little bit further on at the main gate cross site of Grace. Essentially, these two NPCs don't have anything of any major relevance before going into the Shadow Keep, so the next step that I'm actually going to suggest for both of these quest lines is to actually just go straight to the Shadow Keep, or do the other quests beforehand, and trigger the event where Miquella breaks his Great Rune. Essentially, after that happens, you can then go back and speak to both of them in their respective locations, and they will then move on to the Shadow Keep. Again, at this point, I highly recommend that you go through Shadow Keep all the way up to the Storehouse 7th floor site of Grace, because then that way you would have met up with Freyja at that 7th floor site of Grace, and Ansbach will actually be much lower down back at the 1st floor site of Grace. There's going to be a lot of back and forth with this quest, which is why I recommend doing this first of all, because essentially you need to speak with Ansbach and also Freyja in their new locations in the Shadow Keep and exhaust all of their dialogue. After you have spoken to both of them in their respective places in the Shadow Keep, you need to find the secret scroll that Ansbach is looking for, and I'm going to show you how you obviously grab that now, and you do need to go from the 4th floor site of Grace, because when you head out and head to this area outside, just sort of past the guard at the top of the stairs, you will be able to take yet another staircase down to another room, and on the other side of the bookshelves will be the secret scroll item that you need to give to Ansbach. Now, I'm just going to say this very clearly now, do not give this scroll to Ansbach yet, but do go to Ansbach and speak to him again, but you need to use the option to tell him about Freyja's plans. And the reason why you need to talk about Freyja's plans first is because if you don't, you will lock yourself out of Freyja's side of this quest line. So like I say, feel free to go and get the scroll first, just make sure that you definitely tell him about Freyja's plans first, otherwise you cannot progress her quest and get her unique items. But once you've told him about Freyja's plans, you can then give Ansbach the scroll, and then if you reload your game again, so either teleporting back to the site of grace or saving and quitting out, you will be able to speak to him once more, to which he will give you Freyja's letter. And the reason why we need the letter is because when we go back to Freyja and present her with said letter, she will then give us the golden lion shield, as well as giving us another message that we need to give to Ansbach. So once again, go back to Ansbach and pass on the message from Freyja. And essentially, once both of these steps are done, both of these NPCs are now not going to be seen until essentially the final boss fight, but you will actually be able to use Ansbach as a helpful summon during Leda's fight. Now, no matter what you do, Freyja will actually be an enemy during this fight, so God knows what was in that letter, but it clearly wasn't anything good about us. And essentially, after beating Freyja in this fight, you will be able to get her armor as well. But for Ansbach, if you head up to the next area, you will be able to speak to him just before the boss fight arena, and again, exhausting his dialogue here will allow him to become a helpful summon for the final boss fight. And again, much like with Thiollier, I'm not going to show footage of the final boss fight, but like I say, once you beat him and rest at the site of grace in the arena, Ansbach's body will be resting sort of up against the wall towards the entrance, where you can pick up all of his items, including his weapon and his unique incantation. Again, just to be clear, you don't actually have to summon him for the fight, but of course you can do if you want to. But either way, if you summon him or not, his body will still be here at the end of the fight. But as I say, once you've beaten Freyja in Leda's fight and beaten the final boss and got all of the items from Ansbach, that would have completed both of their respective quest lines. But there are actually 2 more quests left to go, so the penultimate quest in this video is going to be Hornsent's quest line. Again, this one is relatively straightforward, but there are multiple ways that this quest can end, so let's go through all the various options. Now, of course, to start this quest, you can actually find Hornsent for the first time right beside Freyja at the 3-path cross site of grace. And essentially, after speaking to him here and exhausting all of his dialogue, he will in fact move to the high road across site of grace whenever you gain access to the shadow altars. You do need to speak to him here, and after exhausting all of his dialogue and getting the cross-site map, we then need to move closer to Shadowkeep to trigger the event where Metyr breaks his rune, and then we can speak to Hornsent again, where he will advise us that he's going to the Shadowkeep himself to take down Metyr. Hornsent will actually help you with multiple fights during the Shadowkeep, more specifically the Golden Hippopotamus, as well as Metyr himself, but actually you can end Hornsent's quest much earlier, because if you speak to Leda at this point, who is also residing at the High Cross Road site of grace, she will inform you that she's actually worried about Hornsent's mindset and thinks he is a threat to Metyr's plans. So she is debating whether or not to take him on, and if you exhaust all of Leda's dialogue, you will actually be able to come to this part of the Shadow Keep, where there will be 2 summon signs, either one to invade Hornsent alongside Leda and defeat him right here, right now, or to actually help Hornsent and defeat Leda instead. So if you wanted to end Hornsent's quest right here, right now, you can do by invading him, and then once you do so, you will not only get his incredible weapon, which is the Falx, which is possibly one of the best weapons from the DLC, but you will also get his armor set too. But if you continue on through the Shadow Keep, he will also be able to help you with the Metyr fight, and again, the rest of his quest will be determined if you summon him in this fight or not. His summon sign is going to be just to the right as you enter the boss arena, sort of on the floor again in front of you, and if you do summon Hornsent in and successfully beat Metyr with Hornsent in your game, he will be able to give a bunch of dialogue and will be in the arena when you rest at the site of grace, to which you can exhaust his dialogue again, and he will then invade you just before you go to the Church of Bud, which is the location where you burn the sealed tree. That will ultimately end his quest. So as I say, if you successfully beat Metyr after summoning Hornsent, he will then become a hostile NPC later on in the DLC, and when you defeat him, then that is when you'll be able to get his his weapon and his armor, but if you do not choose to summon Hornsent in, he will then become an enemy NPC during the Leda fight in Ymir. So essentially with this quest you've got 4 different options you can take, and they all actually give different rewards. I believe if you help Hornsent defeat Leda in the Shadow Keep with those original summon signs I mentioned earlier, you will be able to get the Swift / Ash of War, but if you choose to invade Hornsent and help Leda defeat him, you will get the Lacerating Cross Tree Talisman after speaking to Leda back at the High Cross Road Site of Grace. But if you choose to use none of those summon signs, you can either choose to summon Hornsent in the Mesmer fight and fight him as a 1v1 in the Ancients of Ra and only get his weapon and the armor, or if you don't summon him in, he will then help Leda in Leda's fight in Ymir. After defeating him in that particular fight, you will still only get his weapon and his armor. But either way, whichever route you decide to take, those are the 4 ways that you can end Hornsent's quest. But of course that leaves us with one last final mainline NPC quest that we need to cover for the DLC, and that is none other than Leda herself, and I've left her till last because essentially her quest line is intertwined with a whole bunch of other quests, and there isn't really too many things to point out about her quest specifically. That is because her quest purely determines on how you speak to her throughout the entire DLC. Essentially, after Miquella's rune is broken, she then goes on some sort of warpath, depending on how you speak to her, trying to take down the other NPCs that we've met previously, but there's actually only 2 that she can try and take down, both being Hornsent and also Ansbach, where again there will be summon signs depending on your interactions with Leda, both at the storehouse first floor Site of Grace for obviously Ansbach, and then again in this location just past the Golden Hippopotamus boss fight for Hornsent. But essentially you can defeat Leda earlier on if you actually help either Ansbach or Hornsent and assist them to defeat Leda in those respective fights. And realistically, other than that, as much as this sounds like a complete cop-out, Leda's quest truly is just dependent on how you react with the other NPCs in the game, because again, some of them will side with Leda and aid her during her fight with you in Ymir, which obviously makes that fight a little bit more difficult. But realistically, whenever you decide to beat Leda, whether it's in that final fight in Ymir or beforehand by either helping Ansbach or Hornsent, whenever you do defeat Leda, you will get her armor along with her weapon, and whenever that happens, that essentially ends her quest. So yes, as I say, this quest is purely reactionary to pretty much all of the other quests that we've already mentioned in this video, but either way, by defeating her in any of those 3 fights, that would then complete Leda's quest. And just like that, the video is indeed over. Of course, this is once again going to be one of the longer videos on this channel, probably not quite as long as the previous Ultimate Quest Guide because there was a lot more quests with a lot more steps, but nonetheless the DLC did bring some interesting quest lines, and I know I'm probably annoying a few people because I didn't go into the lore with any of these, but I'm not a lore guy. We will leave that to the professionals, and I'm sure you already know the top content creators if you do want to delve into the lore. But like I say, this is one of the longer videos, so thank you for bearing with me because I know this is coming out much later than everyone else's guides. I just wanted to make sure that I covered all of the information and didn't spread any misinformation, and obviously did all of the testing, tribulations all myself and made sure that everything works. So everything does work as I have said it in this video, so feel free to save this, share it, do whatever you want with this video, and feel free to come back to it whenever you want to do a specific quest. Of course, there's some quests that do require you to do the game multiple times to get all of the rewards, but you can of course get most of the weapons and cool armors and incredible items in just one playthrough. But just before I leave you, I do want to say a big thank you, especially if you're listening right now, because I can imagine you're probably sick and tired of hearing my voice, so I'll do this last little bit quickly. But if you happen to enjoy this or it helped you out in any way, please do hit that like button. Like I said in the intro, it helps out the channel tremendously, and it also lets me know that you want to see more guides like this for other quests, possibly for any other games in the future. But more specifically for Elden Ring, I do go through many different overpowered builds, so if this is your first video you're watching of mine, feel free to subscribe, look back through the catalogue of videos that we've done, because again you'll see some ridiculously overpowered builds. And other than that, like I say, a big thank you for watching all the way through. If you have watched all the way through, feel free to leave a comment saying that you are a legend, and I will of course thank you all personally for being the legend you are, watching this all the way through. But like I say, I've done enough talking now. I'm going to give my voice a rest. So again, thank you for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I guess I will catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.